At -60 degrees, the human body doesn't just freeze. It begins to violently shut down in minutes. 72-year-old Martha Higgins knew this brutal rule of the Yukon better than anyone, but when a desperate, rhythmic scratching echoed from her heavy oak door, the deadliest blizzard of the decade suddenly became the least of her problems. The thermometer nailed to the porch post of Martha's cabin read -58 degrees Celsius. But with the wind chill howling down from the Ogilvy Mountains, the localized temperature felt closer to 70 below. She lived 22 miles outside of Snag, a village in Canada's Yukon Territory holding the record for the lowest temperature ever recorded in continental North America. At this extremity, the cold was no longer just a weather condition. It was a physical entity, a predator, clawing at the chinking between the spruce logs her late husband, Arthur, had laid down in the summer of 1984. Martha was entirely alone. Her nearest neighbor, a roughneck trapper named David Caldwell, was 5 miles away, across a frozen river that was currently swallowed by a total whiteout. The radio broadcast from Whitehorse had cut out 3 hours ago, right after Chief Meteorologist Bill Harrison issued a frantic, final warning. If your vehicle stalls, you will not survive. Stay indoors, keep your fires fed, and pray for dawn. Inside, the cabin was a fortress of survival. The cast-iron Vermont casting stove glowed a dull, angry orange in the center of the room. Martha, a woman whose face was mapped with the deep lines of a life spent battling the elements, fed another split log of dense birch into the fire. Her hands, wrapped in fingerless wool gloves knitted by her daughter Sarah down in Vancouver, were stained with soot and sap. She moved with the slow, deliberate economy of someone who knew that a single sprained ankle or dropped match out here meant certain death. The blizzard struck with the force of a freight train. The wind shrieked through the chimney. A high-pitched, almost human wail that rattled the heavy, triple-paned glass of the windows. The snow wasn't falling. It was firing horizontally, a blinding sheet of white abrasive that scoured the cabin's exterior. Martha poured herself a mug of black coffee from the percolator on the stove, settling into Arthur's old leather recliner. The isolation was absolute. There were no plows, no rescue helicopters, no emergency services that could pierce this storm. Then, she heard it. It was faint at first, easily masked by the roar of the wind. A heavy thud against the thick oak of the front door. Martha froze, the coffee mug halfway to her lips. She held her breath, listening intently. Out here, the wind threw branches, ice chunks, and sometimes even dead birds against the walls. But this sound didn't have the chaotic randomness of debris. Thud. Scratch. Scratch. It was low, rhythmic, and desperate. Martha set her mug down. Her heart, normally steady as a metronome, began a frantic rhythm against her ribs. No human could be out in this. Even if a snowmobile had broken down, the rider would have frozen solid before walking half a mile. She crossed the room, her heavy wool socks silent against the pine floorboards. Reaching beside the doorframe, her hand instinctively closed around the cold steel barrel of the Remington 1-2 gauge shotgun she kept loaded with buckshot. Bears were supposed to be deep in hibernation, but the changing climate had caused strange behaviors in the wildlife over the last few years. Just last winter, David Caldwell had lost 3 sled dogs to a starving, insomniac grizzly. Whimper. The sound penetrated the thick wood, a high, reedy cry that cut through the bass of the storm. It wasn't the roar of a predator. It sounded like a child. Martha hesitated. Opening that door meant letting the deadly cold inside, dropping the cabin's temperature by 20 degrees in seconds. But the agonizing cry came again, weaker this time. With trembling hands, she leaned the shotgun against the wall and threw the heavy iron deadbolt. She braced herself and pulled the door inward. The wind hit her like a physical blow, a blast of sub-zero air that instantly crystallized the moisture in her eyes and stole the breath from her lungs. Through the swirling vortex of white, she looked down at the snow-drifted porch. Lying there, curled into a tight, trembling ball against the threshold, was a grizzly bear cub. It was small, perhaps 40 pounds, its thick brown fur matted solid with ice and snow. Its eyes were squeezed shut, and its breathing was incredibly shallow, little puffs of steam barely escaping its frostbitten snout. The cub had completely given up. It was in the final stages of hypothermia, its body shutting down just as the frozen porch slowly drained the last of its warmth. Martha didn't think. The maternal instinct, honed by years of raising children in the harsh wilderness, overrode her survival training. She fell to her knees, ignoring the agonizing cold seeping through her jeans, and grabbed the heavy scruff of the cub's neck. It felt like lifting a block of solid ice. Grunting with exertion, the 72-year-old woman dragged the dead weight of the apex predator over the threshold and slammed the heavy oak door shut, throwing her back against it to engage the deadbolt. Suddenly, the roar of the blizzard was muffled again, but the silence inside the cabin was now replaced by the harsh, rattling breath of a dying wild animal on her living room rug. Martha stared at the creature. It lay motionless on the woven rag rug, a rapidly melting puddle of ice water forming beneath it. Panic warred with pragmatism in her mind. What have I done? This wasn't a stray dog. This was an untamed grizzly. An animal that, even at this size, possessed jaw strength capable of snapping a human femur and claws that could shred winter gear like tissue paper. But it was dying. Martha sprang into action. She grabbed 3 thick, heavy wool blankets from the cedar chest beneath the window. She approached the cub cautiously, murmuring in a low, soothing voice she used to use on Arthur's skittish hunting hounds. "Easy there, little one." "Easy." She knelt beside it, draping the blankets over the trembling mass of fur, leaving only its snout exposed. Martha quickly retrieved 3 heavy hot water bottles, filling them from the kettle boiling on the stove. She wrapped them in towels and tucked them around the cub's torso, mimicking the body heat of a mother bear. The mother. The thought struck Martha like a physical blow. Grizzly mothers do not abandon their cubs. They are notoriously, violently protective. If this cub was here, where was the mother? Had she been caught in an avalanche? Fallen through the ice on the Snag River? Or was she out there right now, tearing through the whiteout, following the scent of her offspring straight to Martha's door? Martha glanced at the reinforced door, suddenly feeling very vulnerable. She picked up the Remington shotgun, checked the chamber, and placed it on the dining table within arm's reach. As the heat from the stove and the water bottles began to penetrate the cub's icy fur, the smell of the wilderness filled the small cabin. It was the scent of wet pine, frozen earth, and something else, something sharp and metallic. Martha leaned closer, her nose wrinkling. Blood. She gently pulled back the edge of the blanket near the cub's flank. The fur there was stiff, but not with ice. It was matted with dark, frozen blood. Martha's stomach plummeted. She ran her gloved hands over the cub's body, checking for a wound. There was no puncture, no tear. The blood wasn't the cub's. Suddenly, the grizzly cub gasped, a full, ragged inhalation, and its amber eyes snapped open. Martha scrambled backward, putting the coffee table between herself and the animal. The cub didn't attack. It struggled to its feet, the blankets falling away. It was incredibly unsteady, its hind legs shaking violently. It let out a distressed, low bawl, ignoring Martha entirely. Instead, it turned its attention to the front door. The cub stumbled toward the heavy oak barrier, raising its front paws and weakly scratching at the wood. It whimpered, a sound of absolute heartbreak and desperation, pressing its nose against the crack under the door. "No," Martha whispered. "You can't go back out there. You'll die." But the cub wasn't trying to escape. It was trying to get back to something it had left behind. It turned to look at Martha, letting out another urgent bawl. Martha's blood ran colder than the storm outside. The blood on the cub's fur. The desperate scratching. The cub hadn't just stumbled upon her cabin by accident, seeking warmth. It had been pushed here. Sent here. Trembling, Martha walked to the window beside the door. She used the sleeve of her flannel shirt to furiously wipe away the thick layer of condensation and frost built up on the inner pane. Cupping her hands around her face to block the firelight, she pressed her eyes against the freezing glass, squinting into the blinding vortex of the blizzard. At first, there was nothing but churning white. But as her eyes adjusted, a darker shadow emerged in the storm, barely 10 feet from her porch. It was a mound, massive and unmoving. She had dragged herself across the frozen tundra, bleeding out, using her final ounces of strength to herd her cub to the only source of light and heat for 20 miles before collapsing. Martha covered her mouth, a sob catching in her throat. The sheer tragedy of it was overwhelming. But then, the twist came. As Martha stared at the tragic shape of the fallen mother bear, a flash of unnatural light cut through the whiteout. It was a sharp, piercing yellow beam, slicing horizontally through the falling snow. Then another, and another. They weren't flashlights. They were high-powered headlights. Over the screaming wind, Martha heard a sound that made her skin crawl. The high-pitched, mechanical whine of two-stroke engines. Snowmobiles, 3 of them, moving in a tight formation, their headlights illuminating the bloody trail the mother bear had left across the snow. A trail that led directly to Martha's front porch. Poachers. Heavily armed, illegal, bear bile, or pelt hunters who operated deep in the Yukon wilderness, ignoring the laws of man and nature. They hadn't just wounded the mother, they had tracked her through the deadliest storm of the decade to finish the job. And now, their headlights were illuminating the front of Martha's cabin. Martha stepped back from the window, the floorboards creaking beneath her. Heavy boots crunched onto the wooden planks of her front porch. A heavy fist pounded on the door, shaking the frame. "Open up!" A rough, muffled voice yelled from the other side. "We know it's in there!" Martha stood alone in the center of the room. On one side, a terrified grizzly cub. On the other, ruthless men in the dead of winter. There was no police, no David Caldwell, no rescue. There was only Martha, a shotgun, and the coldest night on earth. The pounding on the heavy oak door vibrated through the floorboards, traveling straight up Martha's boots and into her bones. The grizzly cub, recognizing the violent sounds of the men who had slaughtered its mother, scrambled backward, its claws clicking frantically against the pine floor, until it wedged itself between the cast-iron stove and the wood box. It let out a low, terrified whimper, pressing its small paws over its snout. "I said, open the damn door, lady!" The voice roared again. "We know you took the cub inside. Hand it over, and we walk away. Don't make us freeze out here." Martha recognized that voice. It was harsh, grating, and laced with the arrogant drawl of Samuel Cobb. Samuel was a notorious figure around Dawson City, a man who had been investigated by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police half a dozen times for illegal trapping, bear baiting, and selling black market animal parts overseas. A live grizzly cub, especially one this young, would fetch tens of thousands of dollars from exotic wildlife smugglers. They had butchered the mother for her gall bladder and pelt, and now they wanted the prize. Martha's hands stopped trembling. The maternal panic that had gripped her when she pulled the cub inside evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard pragmatism of a Yukon widow. She had survived 30 winters in this brutal landscape. She wasn't about to let a cowardly poacher dictate her fate in her own home. She picked up the Remington .1-2 gauge from the dining table. The steel barrel was freezing to the touch. She gripped the pump action and pulled it back with a sharp, authoritative motion. Shuck shuck. The mechanical clack of a shotgun chambering a shell is a universal language, and in the sudden silence outside the door, it echoed like a thunderclap. "I know it's you, Samuel!" Martha shouted, her voice cutting through the howl of the wind. She pressed her back against the wall beside the doorframe, avoiding the direct line of fire should they decide to shoot through the wood. "You are trespassing on my property, and you are hunting out of season. Get back on your sleds and ride out, or the next sound you hear will be buckshot tearing through this oak." A harsh bark of laughter came from the porch, though it sounded thin against the roar of the blizzard. "You're a crazy old bat, Martha. It's 3 against 1. We have high-powered rifles. You really want to die over a wild animal? That cub is worth 50 grand alive. Slide the deadbolt, or we break a window and let the storm kill you." Martha's mind raced. Samuel was ruthless, but he wasn't entirely stupid. Breaking a window wouldn't just freeze her. It would freeze them too. The moment they stepped inside, the temperature outside was dropping rapidly as midnight approached. At -60, exposed flesh developed severe frostbite in less than 2 minutes. She glanced at the cub, shivering behind the woodbox, then at the heavy iron kettle boiling on the stove. "You try to break my glass, Samuel, and I'll blind the first man who steps through with boiling water before I blow his chest open. You think I won't do it?" Silence fell on the porch, save for the shrieking wind and the heavy, muffled thuds of men shifting from foot to foot. Martha knew the physics of extreme weather better than these greedy poachers did. They had made a fatal error in their pursuit. Adrenaline and the thrill of the hunt had pushed them through the whiteout. But now, standing stationary on a wooden porch in a wind chill of 70 below, their bodies were rapidly losing heat. "Boss, my hands are going numb." A second, younger voice whined from outside. Let's just shoot the lock and go in. Shut up, Toby, Samuel snapped. She's got a shotgun pointed right at the threshold. You want to take point? Martha used their hesitation. She moved silently to the kitchen counter, grabbing a heavy cast-iron skillet with her free hand. She was formulating a desperate plan. She couldn't outgun them, but she didn't have to. She just had to let the Yukon do what it did best. You boys are losing heat, Martha called out, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. How long do you think those fancy synthetic parkas are going to keep you warm standing still? 5 minutes? 5. 10. You're already dead, Samuel. You just haven't stopped breathing yet. Suddenly, a loud, violent crack echoed from the side of the cabin, followed by the shattering of glass. They hadn't gone for the door. They had flanked her. Toby had taken the butt of his rifle and smashed it through the outer pane of the bedroom window. The sound of shattering glass was a violent, percussive explosion that echoed off the heavy log walls of the cabin. Toby hadn't just broken the glass. He had smashed the entire wooden sash of the outer pane, and a millisecond later, the inner pane gave way. The blizzard didn't simply blow into the bedroom. It invaded like a physical, crushing tidal wave. The pressure differential sucked the remaining warmth from the adjacent living room in a single, terrifying gasp. It was a solid wall of negative 70-degree air that instantly knocked framed photos of Arthur off the walls and snuffed out the remaining kerosene lamp on the mantelpiece. Martha felt the moisture in her eyes begin to crystallize instantly, a sensation like hot needles piercing her corneas. Every breath she took burned her throat, the air so cold it felt devoid of oxygen. "I got the glass broke!" Toby yelled, his voice sounding thin, distorted, and snatched away by the howling wind. "I'm clearing the frame! Give me cover!" Martha didn't reach for the shotgun. In the pitch-black, confined space of the hallway, a panicked shot from the heavy 1-2 Gage would likely miss, and she only had 5 shells left. She needed something immediate, something that weaponized the very environment Samuel was trying to use against her. Dropping the cast-iron skillet, she lunged back to the glowing Vermont casting stove. She wrapped her heavily gloved hands around the handle of the large, cast-iron kettle. The water inside was at a rolling, violent boil, rattling the heavy metal lid. She sprinted the short distance to the bedroom doorway, just as a dark, bulky silhouette began to heave itself over the jagged shards of glass in the window frame. Toby was struggling, his heavy synthetic parka snagging on the broken wood. Martha didn't hesitate. Bracing her feet against the floorboards, she swung her arms in a wide, upward arc, hurling the entire 2 gallons of boiling water directly at the shadow in the window. Under normal circumstances, the boiling water would have caused horrific, incapacitating burns. But at minus 60 degrees Celsius, magnified by a howling wind shear, a bizarre and violent scientific phenomenon took over. The Impemba effect, where hot water freezes faster than cold water under specific conditions, occurred instantaneously. The water didn't hit Toby as a liquid. The moment it left the kettle and met the supercooled air, it flash froze. It hit the poacher as a blinding, scalding blast of crystallized steam and tens of thousands of microscopic, razor-sharp ice shards. Toby released a horrific, piercing shriek of sheer agony. The boiling hot ice crystals coated his exposed face, instantly fusing his eyelids shut and blistering his skin in a paradoxical combination of extreme burn and instant frostbite. He threw his hands to his face, lost his balance on the snowy windowsill, and tumbled backward out of the frame, disappearing into the raging whiteout below. "Toby!" Samuel roared from the front of the cabin. The bravado suddenly stripped entirely from his voice. Heavy, frantic footsteps pounded through the deep snow outside, rushing toward the side of the house. Martha immediately dropped the empty kettle. She slammed the heavy bedroom door shut. Leaning her full body weight against it, she dragged a solid oak dresser across the floor, wedging it tightly under the doorknob to barricade the breached room and trap the deadly, freezing air inside. Her lungs burned with the sudden exertion, her breath puffing in thick. The cabin's internal temperature was plummeting rapidly, the frost creeping along the inside of the floorboards like a living thing. Outside, the dynamic had violently shifted. Chaos and primal panic erupted on the porch. Martha crept back to the heavy front door, pressing her ear against the freezing oak. "He's blinded!" His eyes are froze shut. "Samuel! His skin is peeling off!" The third man yelled, his voice cracking into a hysterical sob. Get him on the sled, Samuel commanded. There was real, unadulterated fear in his voice now. The arrogance of the apex predator was completely gone. Start the engines. We're leaving. Now. Martha closed her eyes, a grim, heavy anticipation washing over her. She knew a fundamental law of extreme Yukon machinery that these city-dwelling poachers, blinded by their greed and the thrill of the chase, had fatally overlooked, to sneak up on the cabin and ambush her. They had cut their engines. In record-breaking, sub-zero temperatures, standard engine oil doesn't just get cold. It turns to the consistency of thick, unyielding tar in a matter of minutes. Metal components contract and bind. Fuel lines freeze solid, unless a snowmobile is kept constantly running and idling. Shutting it off in a -60-degree whiteout is an absolute death sentence. The mother bear's final, desperate act of leading them here had forced the poachers to dismount and silence their machines, allowing the deadliest cold on earth to quietly, methodically disarm them. Through the heavy door, Martha heard the frantic, desperate sound of a ripcord being yanked. Sputter. Silence. Pull it again. Harder. Samuel screamed, his voice raw. Sputter. Clunk. The starter cord is frozen tight. The block is seized. The third man cried out, sheer terror elevating his voice an octave. Boss, the throttle cable snapped. They won't turn over. None of them. Try the other one. Try mine. Samuel bellowed, the sound followed by the frantic kicking of metal panels. It's dead. Samuel, we're stranded. The realization hit the men like a physical blow. Without the snowmobiles, they were 22 miles from snag. In a whiteout, walking even a quarter of a mile was impossible. A man would lose his sense of direction, wander in a circle, and freeze solid in less than 30 minutes. Their only source of heat, their only salvation, was on the other side of Martha's door. Heavy fists began to pound frantically against the oak. It wasn't the demanding, authoritative knocking from before. It was the weak, frantic battering of men who knew they were already dead. Martha! Samuel pleaded, his voice muffled by the wind and his thick scarf. Martha, please, open the door. We can't stay out here. Toby is dying. We'll give you the guns. We'll give you the money. Just let us in. Martha stood perfectly still in the center of her freezing living room, the shotgun gripped tightly in her numb hands. She thought of the monstrous silhouette of the mother bear, bleeding out in the snow, using her absolute last heartbeat to save her offspring. The small, terrified grizzly cub had crawled out from behind the woodbox and was sitting at her feet, its amber eyes watching her intently, entirely silent. You brought the storm to my door, Samuel, Martha whispered to the empty room, her voice devoid of anger, replaced only by the cold, unforgiving justice of the wilderness. She did not touch the deadbolt. She turned her back on the door, walked to the stove, and threw 3 more dense, heavy birch logs onto the dying embers, forcing the fire back to a roar to combat the chill seeping from the bedroom. She sat down in Arthur's old leather recliner, keeping the shotgun across her lap. For the next 20 minutes, the desperate pounding continued, growing weaker and more erratic with every passing minute as hypothermia aggressively shut down the poacher's motor functions. The shouting turned into incoherent begging, then to weak whimpers. And finally, there was the sound of bodies clumsily stumbling off the porch, attempting the physically impossible 22-mile trek back to civilization. Then, there was only the sound of the wind. 14 hours later, the blizzard finally exhausted itself. The screaming wind died down to a whisper, leaving behind a blindingly bright, silent world buried in 6 feet of pristine, untouched white snow. When Martha finally threw the deadbolt and pushed the heavy oak door open against a massive snowdrift, the air was still and razor-sharp. The poachers were nowhere to be seen. Their 3 snowmobiles sat in the yard, entirely encased in rime ice, looking like useless, frozen monuments to human arrogance. The mother bear's body was completely buried, marked only by a smooth, peaceful, and undisturbed drift of snow near the edge of the porch. Later that afternoon, the rhythmic, heavy chopping of helicopter blades broke the absolute silence of the Yukon. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, alerted by Martha's emergency shortwave radio transmission once the atmospheric static cleared, touched down in the clearing behind her cabin. They found Samuel and his crew barely 2 miles down the logging road, huddled together under a massive snowdrift. They had succumbed to the extreme elements less than 2 hours after leaving Martha's porch. As Deputy Miller sat at Martha's kitchen table, shaking his head in disbelief while documenting the incident, a specialized animal rescue team from Whitehorse gently coaxed the orphaned grizzly cub into a heated, heavy-duty transport crate. Before entering, the cub stopped at the threshold of the front door. It turned back to look at the 72-year-old woman who had waged a war against ruthless men and unforgiving nature to keep it alive. The cub let out one soft, low, rumbling grunt, a sound Martha felt in her chest, and then stepped into the crate. Martha stood on her porch, her breath pluming in the crisp blue sky, and watched the helicopter ascend, carrying the cub toward a protected wildlife sanctuary. She pulled her heavy wool coat tighter against the biting cold, turned around, and walked back into her cabin, quietly closing and locking the heavy oak door behind her. The Yukon forgives no one, but it does balance the scales. Martha Higgins survived because she understood the brutal laws of the cold, while the poachers perished by ignoring them. The grizzly cub, eventually named Arthur by the Whitehorse Sanctuary staff, grew into a healthy, 600-pound adult, forever carrying the legacy of a mother's ultimate sacrifice and an old woman's uncompromising courage on the coldest night on Earth.